Hi there, my name is Ben Goldfarb. I'm the author of Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. This is my dog, Kit, named after a baby beaver, of course. The coronavirus pandemic is in full swing. Everyone's trapped in self-quarantine, and a few parents and teachers have reached out to me asking if I have any kind of digital beaver lessons that they could share with their students and kids. In response, I put together the following presentation about what makes beavers so special and important. So if you're a teacher trying to fill some virtual class time for your students, or a parent wondering what to do all day with your kids, or a kid wondering what to do all day with your parents, or just a social distancer who wants to learn something while they're stuck indoors, I hope you'll find this useful, and maybe a distraction. So here goes, everything you ever wanted to know and more about beavers. So before we talk about what makes beavers so important, we have to talk about what a beaver is. Beavers are rodents, like rats and mice and squirrels. They're North America's largest rodent. A fully grown beaver gets up to 60 pounds or so in some cases. And they're semi-aquatic rodents, which means they live in and around water. And they've got all kinds of fantastic adaptations to help them lead this very unique semi-aquatic lifestyle. First, they've got incredibly dense fur to help them stay warm underwater. Beavers have some of the thickest fur in the animal kingdom. They have as many individual hairs on a postage stamp size patch of skin as we humans have on our entire heads. Second, they have webbed hind feet like a duck, which makes them powerful, agile swimmers. Beavers can actually hold their breath for up to 15 minutes. What's more, they have a second set of eyelids called nictitating membranes that are transparent and act like goggles underwater. And they've got a second set of lips behind their front teeth so they can chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. I think that's a really cool one. And then what's a beaver's most iconic, recognizable feature? What makes a beaver a beaver? The tail, right? The tail is really a multi-purpose Swiss Army knife. It's a fat storage device, so beavers actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. It's a rudder, and it's an alarm system. Beavers smack their tails on the water to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. Now, the other fabulous beaver feature is their teeth. Beavers' top and bottom incisors actually file each other down into sharp, chisel-like points. And the reason beavers' teeth are orange is because they're structurally fortified with iron that beavers get from their food. That gives them some of the most powerful, durable teeth around. And that's important, of course, because beavers spend their whole life cutting down trees. Beavers eat the cambium, or the inner bark of trees. They're what scientists call choosy generalists. That means they've got a few species they really like aspen, cottonwood, and willow. But they'll eat just about any deciduous tree or trees whose leaves fall in the autumn. They also eat lots of green herbaceous plants like water lilies, wildflowers, even grasses. One thing they absolutely don't eat, though, is fish. You're thinking of otters. Unlike Mr. and Mrs. Beaver in the Chronicles of Narnia, real-life beavers are totally vegetarian. Now, beavers don't just cut down trees to eat the bark. They also use the wood as construction material. And there are two basic types of beaver structures. The first is the beaver lodge. That's the basic beaver housing unit. Underwater tunnels lead up and into the lodge. Inside, there's an elevated nesting platform, usually lined with wood chips, and that's where the beavers live. Beavers are very family-oriented animals, and in a typical beaver colony or family, there are 2 to as many as 8 beavers, so you've got to have a lot of room. That's the male and female, the mother and father, who generally mate for life, the newborn kits or baby beavers, the 1-year-olds, and the 2-year-olds. So you've got 3 year classes of offspring, brothers and sisters, all sharing a lodge together. Not a whole lot of social distancing going on inside a beaver lodge. Here's a cool view of a lodge that's been abandoned. The water level has dropped, the beavers have moved on, and you can really see all of those entrances and exits, those escape tunnels, and you can see what a complex bit of architecture the lodge really is. So that's the beaver lodge. The other type of beaver structure, of course, is the dam, which is made with sticks and rocks and usually sealed with mud. Now, a question you may rightly have is, why go to all the trouble of building a dam? What is the point of this unique, highly labor-intensive behavior that no other animal besides humans really does? The answer has to do with safety. A beaver on land is, as one biologist put it to me, a fat, slow, smelly package of meat. They're very clumsy, awkward walkers. And they get eaten by wolves, cougars, grizzly bears, black bears, coyotes, just about any large carnivore. Here's all that's left of a beaver that crossed paths with a wolf in Minnesota. So for a beaver, building a dam and forming a pond behind it is a way of increasing that watery habitat in which they feel safe. Instead of having to walk overland to that good-looking cottonwood tree and risk being attacked by a cougar, they can swim over to it instead and live to chew another day. Beaver dams come in an amazing diversity of shapes and sizes. A beaver colony will often build one central primary dam to hold back the main pond, and then a series of smaller secondary dams to store water in canals radiating off that central impoundment. Here's a secondary dam in Montana that's probably 3 feet long and 1 foot high. And here's a dam in Minnesota that's probably 400 feet long and 15 feet high, and is undoubtedly the work of many dozens of generations of beavers, each one adding their stick to what their ancestors put down before them. I think that's a pretty mind-boggling feat of engineering. And dams that are that large and that well positioned can create some pretty spectacular ponds. Here's another pond in Minnesota that's probably 250 acres or so, all created by a single dam. Beavers get a lot of deserved credit as builders, but they're also incredible diggers. They excavate elaborate canal networks that often extend hundreds of feet deep into the forest, allowing them to swim up, cut down a tree, and then float it back down to the main pond, all without exposing themselves to predators. So when you combine all that digging and all that building, the results can be pretty remarkable. Here's a cool aerial view of a beaver complex in Colorado, and you can see that if it weren't for all of those dams and canals in the middle of the screen, that stream would just be a straight string running from right to left. But instead, beavers are capturing and storing huge amounts of water in that little mountain valley. And that's a big deal not only for the beavers themselves, but for lots of other critters too. In the American West, where I live, wetlands cover only 2% of the total land, but they support 80% of the biodiversity. So any animal that's capable of creating and maintaining those wetlands starts to look really important. Beavers are what scientists call a keystone species. What does that mean? Well, in architecture, a keystone is the top block in a stone arch. And if you pull that block out, the entire arch crumbles. Beavers play a similar role in North American ecosystems, holding up an astounding menagerie of other species. Waterfowl like ducks and trumpeter swans nest around the ponds that beavers create. What you're seeing here is a great blue heron rookery at a beaver wetland in Wisconsin. Moose feed on the willows and aquatic vegetation that grow in and around beaver ponds. And muskrat, mink, otters, and other semi-aquatic mammals hang out in beaver ponds as well. Many species of amphibians, frogs, toads, and salamanders, breed in beaver ponds. And in fact, in some places, if it weren't for beavers, the boreal toad would have nowhere to mate at all. The biological connections that beavers make are endless. This is an abandoned beaver pond in Minnesota, where a pack of wolves actually took over that beaver lodge and raised their pups in there. Yes, beavers even create habitat for their direct predators. One of the most important connections is between beavers and salmonids. That's the group of fish that includes trout and salmon. If you're a baby salmon or a trout, just the length of a person's pinky finger, you don't want to live in the main fast current. You want to live in a slow pool or an eddy or a side channel or a backwater. That's the kind of complex, slow water refuge that beavers create. No wonder, then, that there have been lots of studies connecting beavers to increased production and survival of salmon, and that many fisheries managers and biologists consider beaver restoration one of the most important steps we can take to recover endangered salmon populations. Still, there are certain anglers and biologists who resist beavers, arguing that their dams will make it harder for returning adult salmon to migrate to their spawning grounds. But it's important to remember that beaver dams are nothing like giant, concrete, human-built dams. Fish can jump over beaver dams, swim around them, even wriggle through the wood. Here's a stream I visited a few years ago just outside Seattle. In the top right corner, you can see the Beaver Dam. And in the bottom left corner, you can see the two freshly dug coho salmon nests. The evolutionary connection between beavers and salmonids is so deep that it even inspired my favorite bumper sticker. Beavers taught salmon to jump. Now, historically, we know these kinds of beaver-built watery habitats were far more prevalent on the landscape than they are today. Early naturalists estimate that before European colonists arrived, there were as many as 400 million beavers in North America. Today there are perhaps 15 million or so they're not endangered, but they're certainly much reduced from their former glory. And those hundreds of millions of beavers would have created hundreds of millions of acres of pond and wetland habitat. When you read the journals of old trappers or explorers, you come to recognize that many areas that today are dry pasture land were historically beaver wetlands. Here's one nice account from Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame, describing how, in the Missouri Basin in present-day Montana, he and Clark could see beaver dams in every tributary as far as the eye could see up into the base of the mountains. But the heyday of the beaver wouldn't last long. In the early 1600s, European explorers like Henry Hudson and Adrian Block began trading for beaver pelts with Native Americans. Pretty soon, fur traders had wiped out beavers from every river, lake, pond, and stream in the Northeast and began spreading west and south. Unfortunately for beavers, their fur makes really good hats, which were all the rage back in Europe. Beavers, along with timber and cod, were one of the most important economic resources that Europeans found in North America. The beaver trapping industry was so important, in fact, that practically every early American historical event has some kind of beaver connection. The Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812, even the American Revolution were all fueled in part by the drive for beaver pelts. And it was beaver traders and trappers who spread the diseases that decimated many Native American tribes. So important were beavers to early American economies that the Oregon Territory even minted a beaver coin, whose value was fixed to one beaver pelt. So just as some fringe economists advocate going to the gold standard today, the Oregon Territory had the pelt standard. Of course, this relentless trapping was very bad news for the beavers themselves. By the mid-1800s, beavers were just about extinct in the lower 48, and only 100,000 or so remained in North America, nearly all of them in the remote Canadian wilds. The fur trade was just as devastating for aquatic ecosystems in general. What happens when you kill hundreds of millions of beavers? Well, hundreds of millions of beaver dams break down, and hundreds of millions of acres of beaver ponds and wetlands drain. We don't think about beaver trapping in the same terms as the deforestation of New England, or the busting of the Midwestern prairie, or gold mining in California, as one of the formative ecological disasters that shaped North America. But there's no question that for many species, like moose, or wood ducks, or coho salmon, the loss of beavers would have been a profound environmental catastrophe. Without beaver dams acting as speed bumps and slowing down water, thousands of miles of streams would have eroded into gullies, turning their floodplains from lush wetlands into dry pastures. Luckily, in the early 1900s, the tide began to turn. Naturalists like Enos Mills recognized that beavers were worth more alive than dead, and states from New York to California began reintroducing beavers to their lands and waters. The most famous beaver reintroduction project occurred in Idaho. There, biologists first tried moving beavers on horseback, only to find the horses didn't take too kindly to that. The year was 1948, though, so they did have plenty of surplus parachutes lying around after World War II. A biologist named Elmo Heater designed a special crate that fell open upon landing and airdropped 76 beavers into the Idaho wilderness. Incredibly, 75 of the beavers survived, and when Heater flew back over the drop locations a year later, he found that beavers had built dams and lodges in all the places they'd been released. The crazy project actually worked. To be clear, this is no longer considered state-of-the-art in beaver management. As beaver populations recovered throughout the 20th century, they ran into a problem. In their absence, humans had colonized all the best habitat. It turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat is one and the same. We both like broad, fertile floodplains and low gradient streams. I'd argue that it's us, not them, who is the true nuisance species, but there's no question that when humans and beavers overlap, conflicts can occur. Here's a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts that I visited that had recently been refurbished at a cost of about $1 million. Just a few months after their completion, a resident beaver colony had the tracks underwater. Here's a cabin I stumbled upon in Taos, New Mexico. If you look closely, you can see the beavers built their dam to the base of the porch and then incorporated the house in the rest of the dam. I wouldn't want to be that cabin owner, but you have to admire the beavers' ingenuity. Beavers also love building in road culverts, which they plug up as though the culvert is a leak in their dam. The water rises and the road washes out, a very expensive problem to fix. Sometimes beavers get even more creative. A few years ago, a beaver broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack when it was apprehended by the authorities. That feels like it must be a metaphor for something. The way these conflicts are usually handled is by trapping out the offending beaver. Every year, the U.S. Department of Agriculture kills around 20,000 beavers, and private trappers kill hundreds of thousands more. The problem with this reflexively lethal approach to beaver management is twofold. First, when you kill beavers, you're also potentially destroying that wonderful pond and wetland habitat they create. What's more, all you're doing is putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers. As long as there's still wood and water, they're going to find their way back. As a result, in many cases we're better off taking a non-lethal approach and figuring out ways to live with beavers rather than killing them over and over and over again. Here's a nice example of beaver coexistence at a reservoir in Colorado, where a land trust wrapped protective wire fencing around native cottonwood trees they didn't want beavers to cut down. Meanwhile, they left the non-native Siberian elm trees unfenced. That's invasive species control by beaver. When the problem is beaver-related flooding, that's a little more challenging to solve, but there too, we've got options. This contraption is called a flow device, a pipe and fence system that reduces water levels to a point that's acceptable to both beavers and humans. This particular device was made by Mike Callahan, founder of the Beaver Institute, who's found that flow devices work 87 to 97% of the time. Here's another model in Vermont by Skip Lyle, founder of Beaver Deceivers International. Scientists have found that every dollar you spend on one of Skip's beaver deceivers returns more than $8 in avoided trapping and road maintenance costs. Clearly, coexisting with beavers isn't just possible, it's profitable. In the city of Logan, Utah, researchers even built flow devices in a beaver-maintained wetland in a Walmart parking lot. If Walmart can do it, anyone can. In some states, live capturing troublemaking beavers and relocating them far from people is also an option. This is a beaver live trap called a Hancock trap. Just bait it with some beaver scent lure, set it out overnight, and voila, you'll probably catch yourself a beaver. Remember, beavers are very family-oriented animals, So your goal is always to catch the entire colony together and move them as a unit. The problem is that a lot of the beavers you're going to catch are those 2-year-old dispersing teenage beavers who have just left home and don't yet have a family of their own. When that happens, some biologists operate a service you might call Beaver Tinder, where they pair up eligible males and females and hope to make compatible couples. It's a cool idea, but there's one major obstacle. It's impossible to tell at a glance a male beaver from a female. Male beavers have internal genitalia, which makes sense. If you're an animal that spends its whole life swimming through log jams, you don't want some little dangling appendage that you're going to get snagged on something. But that makes it hard on scientists. This picture is of Sandy and Chomper. Sandy's the female, Chomper is the male. Yet there's no way of telling who is whom, at least not with your eyes. While beavers have poor eyesight, they have amazing senses of smell and actually possess 2 different sets of scent glands, the castor sacs and the anal glands, which they use to mark their territories and send messages to other beavers. Although we humans have poor noses by comparison, we too can decode some of the mysteries of beaver scent. By expressing the anal gland, as I'm doing here, squirting a dollop of scent secretion onto a tissue, and then sniffing it, you can tell whether a beaver is a male or a female. Motor oil, and it's a boy. Cheese, and it's a girl. That sounds unscientific, but a beaver biologist can do this with about 99% accuracy. Once you've figured out which beaver is which and made a happy couple, it's time to move them. Because relocated beavers haven't yet had time to build a dam and lodge, they're vulnerable to predators like cougars and wolves. Fortunately, there are a few things we can do to give them a leg up. Here's a human-built starter lodge that beavers can move into until they've had time to build a lodge of their own. Some biologists go a step further and build beavers their own dam, creating a pool of water deep enough that beavers feel safe and comfortable and stay where you stick them. Please be advised that broken fingers may be an occupational hazard of this technique. Whatever your tactics though, the important thing is just to get the beavers out there. By live trapping and relocating beavers, we're not only giving individual animals an opportunity to survive, we're helping to repopulate beavers in watersheds where they historically thrived but haven't yet recovered from the fur trade. Here's a beaver release being conducted by a biologist named Drew Reed in the Gros Ventre River Valley in Wyoming. As you can see, Drew moved the parent and the kit together, giving the family the best opportunity to survive. The beavers are clearly a bit confused, having just been moved 50 miles or so from their home, and everything doesn't go quite according to plan. The parent goes upstream while the kit goes downstream, and Drew hustles to intercept the baby and reunite it with its parent. Although we'll never know whether these particular beavers survived, the important thing is that Drew is giving them a shot, far from areas where they could conflict with people. At this point, you might be wondering, why go to all this trouble? Sure, beavers create great fish and wildlife habitat, but what do they do for us Homo sapiens that's so crucial? As it happens, beavers provide people all kinds of valuable services. It's no exaggeration to say that the average beaver is worth many thousands of dollars, a heck of a lot more than the $20 value of its pelt on the open market. So what do beavers do that's so great? First of all, they're incredibly talented at storing water. Individual beaver ponds can store hundreds of thousands, even millions of gallons of water, acting like reservoirs that farmers, ranchers, and other water users can draw upon during times of drought. Importantly, beavers don't just store water in their ponds. The weight of those ponds also forces water into the ground, recharging aquifers and rehydrating the soil itself. You might think of beavers as little irrigators, watering valleys and growing plants at an epic scale. That's a big deal for guys like James Rogers, a rancher in northeast Nevada who embraces beavers on the land he manages. As James pointed out when I visited him, beavers increase grass production tenfold. That means more weight on his cows and more money in ranchers' back pockets. As a result, ranchers all over the country, people whose own fathers used to kill beavers, are coming to love these industrious rodents. Another cool beaver trick is improving water quality. When streams hit beaver dams, they slow down, dropping all of the nitrogen, heavy metals, sediment, and other pollutants they've been carrying. Beaver wetlands thus act like kidneys, filtering out contaminants and leaving water cleaner than when it arrived. That's why scientists are deploying beavers in places like Maryland, where the animal's ponds and wetlands can capture nitrogen and phosphorus before that agricultural pollution can reach Chesapeake Bay. Beavers aren't just good at fighting droughts, they're also geniuses at stopping floods. Their ponds slow down, spread out, and store water that would otherwise race downstream and damage farms and houses. Here's a really nice dam in the United Kingdom, where Eurasian beavers were recently reintroduced after hundreds of years of absence, in large part because of their flood-fighting prowess. In England, researchers found that just a single pair of beavers captured 30% of the stormwater that rushed into their pond complex. Scale up the population from 2 beavers to 200,000, and you start to see the potential. So the last really critical beaver benefit that I wanted to talk about is their role as agents of climate change adaptation. Beavers' ability to keep water on the landscape runs in some ways in direct opposition to climate change, which is making the world hotter and, in many places, drier as well. A hotter, drier world is also a more flammable one, which is why we've seen increasingly intense, devastating wildfire seasons in recent years. Here are a few pictures by a beaver scientist named Joe Wheaton of the Sharp Fire in Idaho. And you can see that those uplands have been burnt to a crisp, and the only green, wet, blue, living place on the landscape is that beaver-influenced valley bottom. So the notion that beavers can help us adapt to climate change and wildfire by creating fire refugia, where animals and plants can retreat during times of wildfire, or even fire breaks that stop fire in its tracks, is increasingly promising. Given all the wonderful things that beavers do, it's fair to ask, why aren't they more widely embraced? Why do we kill so many of them? The answer, I think, is that we've forgotten what our landscapes are supposed to look like. Because we lived without beavers for so many years, we came to believe that a healthy stream was straight, free-flowing, fast-moving, and gravel-bottomed. The kind of stream you might see in a fly fishing magazine. The streams that beavers create, meanwhile, are very different. They're slow-moving and boggy and filled with dead and dying trees. They don't stay cooperatively within their banks, but spill recklessly onto the floodplain. They look, in short, like chaos. But as we've seen, this kind of beaver-created chaos is actually far healthier, not only for birds, fish, amphibians, and other wildlife, but for us humans as well. It turns out that the best thing we can do for many ecosystems is to entrust them to a semi-aquatic rodent. Beavers can begin to heal our broken landscapes a heck of a lot more instinctively and cheaply than we can. As the mantra of the Beaver Believer goes, let the rodent do the work. So with that, I'll say thanks so much for tuning in. I hope this was even remotely helpful during this crazy time. There's my website, so feel free to get in touch with any comments or questions. It has a contact form. And I want to conclude by suggesting an activity. This is something you could do just about any time, but it's especially appropriate during a pandemic because it is social distancing of a fashion. And here's the way it works. Beaver infrastructure is so monumental that in a lot of cases you can see it from space. So here I am zooming in on Google Earth to Voyageurs National Park, which has a fair claim at beaver capital of the world. And you click around for a couple seconds, find yourself some ponds, zoom in, and sure enough, there are the beaver dams, there are the lodges, you can see all the canals radiating off. You found, in just a few seconds, some pretty cool beaver infrastructure. So that's a fun activity that you can do at home, socially distant. But you can take it a step further, too, because, of course, you can't go visit Voyageurs National Park right now. So this time I'm zooming in to a pretty developed area where I-84 and I-90 meet in Massachusetts. And I'm just zooming in, find a wetland immediately, and there's a pretty beautiful little labyrinth of beaver canals. And you can actually go visit this sort of thing while still maintaining social distancing protocols. Head over at dusk, get outside, tromp around a little bit. There will almost certainly be no one else at this random beaver pond. If they are, they'll be at least 6 feet away. You may or may not see the beavers, but you'll certainly see something cool, whether that's a heron or a muskrat or some salamanders. There's going to be some kind of amazing biological phenomenon to observe at this beaver pond and take your mind off everything going on in the world right now. Beaver pond social distancing, I highly recommend it. Assuming, that is, that you haven't been instructed to stay at home completely. Of course, it goes without saying that you should only travel to beaver ponds locally, prudently, and in accordance with guidance from public health officials. Probably shouldn't have to say that, but I think we need to say it right now. So anyway, thanks again for watching and for caring about wildlife in general and beavers in particular. Stay safe and practice good hand hygiene. Okay, Kitty, your work here is done. Good job!